All right, good afternoon, everyone. Can you please let me know in the chat box if you can hear me clearly? All right, welcome to our October Environmental Health webinar. My name is Tina Chen, and I'm a Knowledge Translation Scientist here at the National Collaboration Center for Environmental Health. As we continue to host webinars from home, please excuse us if we run into any technical issues. And please make sure to put yourselves on mute throughout the entire webinar. We may have to remove participants from the webinar if the noise interruption continues. And you may type your questions into the chat box at any time during the webinar, and we will get to them at the end. So today we have the great pleasure of having Lorraine McIntyre from the BC Center for Disease Control to talk about her work in analyzing alcohol levels in kombucha beverages. Lorraine McIntyre is a food safety specialist with the Environmental Health Services at the BC Center for Disease Control. Lorraine has worked at the BCCDC for over 25 years, the first 10 years in provincial labs in water and food poisoning, and since 2005 has been with environmental health. She liaises with academia, industry, and government stakeholders, creates best practice food guidelines, and provides advice on topical issues. Lorraine's role includes research and education, and she enjoys working with students. She is currently chairing a national fermented foods working group. Lorraine's summertime hobby resulted in 120 liters of cider in her basement. Thanks, Lorraine. Now over to you.
Thanks, Tina. It's my pleasure to present today. And for those of you who know me, I'm out of wine bottles. So if anyone has any they can spare, I've got 60 more liters to bottle up. Okay, ethanol levels in kombucha, concern or a calamity? This is a project we did last summer. We got the report written, and then COVID hit, and so it's my pleasure today to talk to you about something that has nothing to do with COVID. So next slide. I want to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the unceded Coast Salish territories, the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. So that's very appreciated. I also wanted to acknowledge many people at the very beginning of this presentation that helped with this study. It would not have been possible without the seed funding from the BCCDC Foundation for Public Health. This funding was matched by the BC Liquor and Cannabis Regulatory Board. And my very grateful acknowledgements to Dr. Paula Brown and Dr. Michael Chen with the BCIT Natural Health and Products Group. They did all of the ethanol testing for us in the kombucha through their NCCEH Research Chairs program, and that was a huge contribution. It wouldn't have been possible without them. Many EHOs, some of you probably on the call now, helped from the regional health authorities in British Columbia and submitted samples to us. And I would also like to acknowledge Sally Chen, who spent the summer with us doing her Master's Food Science program practicum. So on behalf of Sunsick and myself, let's get going. So calamity, this really was an acronym for the project, Kombucha Alcohol Levels Affecting Pregnant Mothers, Infants, and Toddlers. It really helps to have a good acronym to get funding. So what I want to talk to you today is why we should care about low levels of alcohol in our beverages, and how we can recognize alcohol in fermented beverages, and then discuss some of the roles that we have in public health and as inspectors. So I've already mentioned our partners and funders. So let's start off with what kombucha is. If you're dialed into this talk, hopefully you do know about kombucha. It's basically a brewed tea that you add sugar to, and then you use a SCOBY, a symbiotic culture of bacteria and yeast that you apply to the tea, and it will ferment the drink. It becomes slightly alcoholic, but the fermentation goes all the way through the alcohol stage through to the vinegar stage. So it ends up being kind of tart, a little bit bubbly, And it's known from many different names as a tea mushroom, a tea fungus, also called a Manchurian mushroom. And it's quite often described by people who enjoy drinking it as a functional beverage. It's got many different probiotics in it, so it's very good for gut health and gut metabolism and other organic acids. So it's actually quite a good drink. I drink it myself. And why do we need to care about this? Well, let's talk a little bit about uh, alcohol risks, even low levels of alcohol risks. And we're going to start by showing you this picture of a young child, a young toddler, drinking some brand of sugary cola. And one good thing about kombucha is that generally it doesn't have a lot of sugar in it. But even though it has fewer calories and only a few grams of sugar, when children are offered kombucha, what are the risks for alcohol? So I'm going to spend a bit of time talking about this. And really, alcohol, the dose makes the poison, is very true for alcohol as well. And children, of course, especially younger toddlers, are, they don't weigh very much. And so it doesn't take very much of an ethanol dose to affect their health, between 50 and 100 milligrams per deciliter. And children have a much higher metabolic rate than we do. They don't have the liver enzymes that we do, the alcohol dehydrogenase, and so they can overheat rapidly. And in fact, there's been studies showing that the blood alcohol levels at the hospitals will actually increase 2 to 3 times after the initial admit to the emergency. So the different kinds of symptoms that you can see are lethargy, hypoglycemia, and of course in extreme cases when children are drinking a lot of pure grain alcohol, there's seizures and death. But even with low doses, if children are exposed, you may think they're just sleepy, but actually this is a medical condition that we need to be concerned about. So let's have a look at the doses now that can affect children. So in this little table that I have, you can see along the top is the weight of perhaps a young toddler, 10 kilograms or 20 kilograms. That's running along the top. And then running along vertically in the column, I've got the percent of alcohol by volume, or ABV. And I go from 0.5 at the top down to, say, moderately high level of alcohol at 2.5%. Well, if a toxic dose is 50 milligrams per deciliter, where you should have your child be monitored in emergency, you can see that at 2.5%, if you have a very low weight toddler at 10 kilograms, it's only going to take about 125 to 150 milliliters to reach that toxic dose of 50. So in the pictures on the right that I took, I poured some kombucha out into a beaker and showed you a typical coffee mug, just to show that it doesn't take very much for lower weight toddlers to reach that toxic dose. And I would really like to acknowledge Dr. David McPhee, our medical resident, who put this together for us. And although I'm showing this for kombucha, this is still valid for any drink or food that contains ethanol or alcohol. Okay, how about pregnancy? Well, I mentioned in the market, kombucha is viewed as a healthy option containing probiotics and good gut bacteria, and these are perceived health benefits. So although kombucha has bioactive components that can be antioxidant or detoxifying or antimicrobial, the kombucha community is going to tell you that it has a role in immune health and mental health and cancer and cardiovascular disease prevention. And to be fair, the very low acidic pH of kombucha probably makes it antimicrobial. But there's been very few rigorous studies showing these health benefits. On the other hand, there's been many, many studies showing the risks of drinking alcohol during pregnancy, such as the fetal alcohol syndrome. And studies at low alcohol levels of ingestion don't clearly show fetal risk or cognitive impairment, but the studies here are very unclear on the evidence, and it's not suggesting that there's no risk. So in the end, this is the statement that we have for any amounts of alcohol during pregnancy, is that there is no safe exposure level for alcohol, and kombucha may expose pregnant women to non-trivial amounts of alcohol. So one of our concerns is that women who are pregnant may not know that there is potential for alcohol to be present in some brands of kombucha. So what about us? Well, this is kind of disappointing news for those of us that like the occasional drink, but it is true that low levels of alcohol are a risk over a person's lifetime. And there has been studies from the Canadian Institute of Substance Abuse or Substance Use Research that says these effects are accumulating, so that even one drink a day could lead to a lifetime risk of cancer. And the evidence for this is accumulating, not the alcohol. Okay. How about other groups within our population? Because this is a population risk given that kombucha is sold quite widely. Well, there are many other reasons and groups of people who may wish to avoid alcohol consumption. So if you look at this photo at the top going around clockwise, there's a young woman wearing a hijab, and she could be Muslim wishing to avoid drinking any kinds of alcohol. Because part of her faith is to avoid it. There could be people on different types of prescription medication. Your bus driver that may be drinking this beverage and not know that there's low amounts of alcohol in it. People with substance use disorders who are trying to avoid all alcohol, and they could be recovering alcoholics. And then there's drivers and young drivers who are, at least in BC, they're not allowed to have any alcohol in their blood system. And you may be drinking this drink, and maybe if you blow on a breathalyzer, you would fail it. So it's really important that people understand where alcohol is in their foods. So other than ethanol or alcohol, are there any other risks linked to kombucha? Yes, there are, although they are very, very rare. So there have been issues linked to the high acid levels in kombucha. So all of the kombucha that we tested, and we'll get to that in a minute, was below a pH of 4.2. Significantly, there were some below a pH of 2.5. Now, this does not pose any problem for the normal population, but if you have an underlying illness or if you drink a lot of kombucha, you can develop acidosis, metabolic acidosis, and it has been linked to other issues. There's a review paper that I'm showing at the bottom. Honestly, in the last 40 years, there's only been 10 other illnesses in total reported. It's not very many, so I'm not going to go through them all, but if you're at all interested, you can have a look at that great review paper. So looking at alcohol in the marketplace, what are the strategies that we have to address alcohol risk for ourselves and the general public? Well, I'm just showing the main ones here, labeling. So we inform consumers that a product contains alcohol. Availability. In BC and in some other provinces, you can only get alcohol at your liquor store. We inform consumers about the risk of alcohol through media campaigns. And one of the key things with most of, or I should say with all of these products on the market, is that the ethanol is stable and it won't increase during consumer handling. So all the products you see here in this photo are on the shelf, it's shelf stable, and they're at room temperature. So I'm going to refer back to this at the end of the presentation. Okay. Let's tell you a little bit more about kombucha and the fermentation process. These are from a paper in the journal called Cell, and it shows the SCOBY on at the top of the photo, the kombucha drink photo on the left, and then on the right-hand side, you can see some of the yeast and the bacteria. So these microbial cells, some of them will form the pellicle. That's the white floaty bit that you see in the picture. And others of the cell are going to ferment the sugar. The lactic acid bacteria are going to ferment the sugars to produce ethanol, and the yeasts and carbon dioxide will form. And then you'll get the acetic acid bacteria forming the vinegar portion. So in this schematic, you see that it's yeast that's breaking down the sugar into glucose and fructose, and then you have various bacteria creating both the vinegar and the ethanol to make acetic acid. So it's really a two-stage fermentation. So if you want to make apple cider vinegar at home, which I'm also doing with some of my apple cider, first you ferment it to the alcohol stage, and then you add the acetobacter to get it to the acetic acid stage. You can also see there's many specialized bacteria. So I can never say this right, but the Kombucha xylanum at the top there, that forms the cellulose or the pellicle layer. So that white mat that you see floating on top of the kombucha. So when the fermentation occurs, the pH of the beverage, so tea and coffee is around a pH 5, 5.5. It'll drop within a few days to pHs below 4.2, and they generally stay there and they get more acidic as time goes on. So now let's talk about what we found. And this photo is a typical photo of what we saw when we went to any Lower Mainland grocery store. We did sampling by convenience. So if we saw a product, we bought it. We bought one of every flavor that we could find, because really we were just trying to see what does the alcohol levels look like in these products. So we weren't trying to randomize our study. We also asked the health authorities to submit samples from their retail stores and from processors in their areas, especially restaurants and the actual processors, because those are places that we generally didn't go into to get kombucha. We purchased or received products in both cans and bottles. And on the right-hand side, in some places that we went into, there were bulk samples. Sometimes, so what's going on in this little mini refrigerator here is that there's probably a 20-liter keg or 10-liter keg underneath, and it's hooked up to the tap on the top. And sometimes we knew what kind of kombucha it was, so who the processor was, but that wasn't always the case. So if it wasn't advertised or labeled, then we just assigned it the name of the store that it was purchased, and that was also similar to the restaurants. If restaurant samples were collected by the health inspectors and they noted the actual processor and it was different from the restaurant, we collected that information. Otherwise, we just assigned it to the restaurant. We carefully maintained a chain of custody throughout the project to ensure that things were received cold and kept refrigerated right away. And as I mentioned, the testing itself was done by Dr. Paula Brown and Dr. Michael Chan at their BCIT lab, and they kindly gave us a tour of their lab. You can see here this method that they used was the GCMS headspace method. It's got a very sensitive limit of detection, and they've also done quite a lot of work in validating this method, and it follows AC guidelines. And it's important maybe to point out here that, you know, if you were to test the alcohol level of vodka, it's a clear grain alcohol, but kombucha has a lot of things floating around in it, and it's a very turbid liquid. And so the test method itself is actually kind of important. Some of the test methods don't work as well. So this headspace method, basically you put the sample in the tube and it'll volatilize a little bit at the top so that you get a clean sample so you know how much ethanol is in there. Okay, let's give you some facts about our survey. All in all, we collected 684 samples between June and October. There were 142 different premises visited. You can see they're mainly retail grocery stores that in the Lower Mainland area. There were also some restaurants, some processors, and there were some samples collected by folks at farmers markets or at gyms or recreational centers. So all in all, that counted for 53 different processors, and just under 1/3 actually did exceed the BC regulatory limit of 1% alcohol by volume here. So if we were to look at the places of processing, at the top, you can see a little table that shows the different provinces and also countries that we found on the labels that told us where the kombucha was made. Obviously, most of the samples, just under 50%, were from BC. It's not surprising because we're in the province of BC. We did have a few more samples from Alberta. There was only one main brand that we found on the shelves from Ontario and one main brand from Quebec. Many more from the US, one from Australia as well that I actually have a picture of that brand, and I'll tell you about that later. So again, summarizing the results, I said about 1/3 were above the 1% regulatory limit. Most of the ones that were above 1% were between 1 and 2%, but there were just under 6% or just over 6% that were above 2% alcohol by volume. So while I just want to say, while alcohol was there in kombucha, it was not present at really high levels, but still at levels high enough to pose a concern, especially for those at-risk groups that we talked about earlier. So the next slide is where things get concerning for us here in BC. This is broken down by where the kombucha was made, and you can see that that sort of salmon pink color above 1%. Most of the higher levels of alcohol, especially when it's higher than 1.5%, were from here in BC. And again, it may not be surprising that this occurred because over half of the samples that we found were from BC, but it actually does show that there's some issues. So next, I'm going to show you a couple of slides to say, well, is this just because of BC? Or is there some other reason that we were finding almost 1/3 of the samples being over the 1% alcohol by volume level? So there's two slides here. I'm going to show you non-BC processors. So we divided the results by who made it. I'm going to show you the ones that aren't in BC and then the ones that are in BC. And you don't need to, it's kind of a busy slide, but basically if it's green, we didn't find alcohol levels above 1% in any of the samples. If it's yellow, 20% or less of the samples were above 1%. So you can see the one, the brand that says USA 7 there. We did find one sample just on the threshold here. But there were some other samples that had one or more results high. And then this one way over here, because we only sampled it one time, it didn't seem fair to put it in red. So before we decided to say, oh, this was an issue with this processor, we wanted at least 6 samples. But what happens in BC when we do this similar study is we do find that there's quite a few processors that have alcohol levels in their products that we purchased at retail 1 or more times. So what's going on here? This is related to the issues of the method of kombucha processing, because we can see that in other countries, in the US and other countries and other provinces, there's less of a problem. So unfortunately, over 70% of BC processors had what we would call a definite problem with controlling alcohol in their kombucha, or a potential problem. And why is that? I'm going to whip through a few other results. We did look for E. coli. We didn't find any. So this is just a picture of the positive control slide. So again, kombucha is really acidic, and E. coli, we use that commonly as an indicator of sanitation. We didn't find any problems with E. coli in the products. I mentioned pH as well. We did find around 7% of the samples were very acidic. They were below a pH of 2.5. And as mentioned, even Coca-Cola is very acidic. There's many products that are very acidic, and it's not a problem for most people. So although we found this and tracked this, it wasn't of great importance. But what we did find is that some kombucha samples, if they're stored at room temperature, will actually explode. So this picture is showing after the kombucha is sold to the consumer at retail in the refrigerator, if the person who purchased it doesn't know that it should remain refrigerated, because canned kombucha does look a lot like pop. There's at least pressure that builds up inside because the fermentation is still going on. It hasn't gone to completion, it's still occurring. And these particular cans of kombucha were ones that, I bought in a 6-pack, and I thought, oh, let's leave a few out on the bench and see what happens. And then I went on holidays and they exploded, and it was a big mess to clean up for all of us. So this is what happens. So at least we know one thing for sure: all kombucha must be stored refrigerated, or there'll be a problem with both the alcohol rising or potentially even the bottles or cans exploding, right? Well, that's not true. I mentioned one brand from Australia. This is the Remedy brand, and you can see some of the kombucha here is in the refrigerator, and some of it is stored just at room temperature. And in fact, this product, their manufacturing method removes all sugar, so there isn't anything left for yeast to ferment and for alcohol to develop and CO2 gas to form. So in fact, it depends on the processor. It depends on several factors, such as whether the yeast is active after the kombucha process. Perhaps they, as well, this particular brand has no sugar, but there may be other kombucha processors that didn't have problems. And likely that was because they have very good methods at controlling yeast, or perhaps they rapidly chill down their product and remove the yeast, or their centrifugation methods to remove things. Even though it's still a raw product, there are ways to deal with this. So from a public health point of view, the reason we're kind of not puzzled but concerned about this is, do retailers understand there's differences, and what kind of instructions are they getting at point of sale? So because this brand is allowed to be left out at room temperature, is there potential for them to perhaps not refrigerate other products as promptly as they should? So one last slide on the experiments that we did. We actually looked at yeast activity in the kombucha that we purchased. And what you're seeing in the first picture on the left, in the very first tube, is the control. So this is yeast media, and inside there's this other tube that's inverted. These are called Durham tubes. And if yeast is in the kombucha that we put in the tube, it'll form the gas and it'll push this tube up, so it'll displace the media that's in that tube. And you can see in that same picture, the middle picture, you can see that, yeah, this one, there was a lot of gas being produced. So this tells us that the yeast is still active, which is one of the big issues with kombucha, where alcohol will rise. Of interest, though, on the right-hand side, this is one of those other brands that never had any problems, and you can see that the pellicle still formed. So the SCOBY layer, that white mat that floats on top, that cellulose layer, but no gas. So it is still a raw live product, but somehow this processor has managed to control the yeast within their product, so there isn't excess alcohol forming after it's been, kept at room temperature on the bench for a while. Okay, so going back to those strategies that we talked about earlier, we did a labeling assessment. Actually, yeah, we did a labeling assessment to look at precautionary statements, handling information, federally required labeling, and market advertising labeling. So we couldn't do those on all of the processors. We only did those on the processors where we either got the cans or the bottles. And so we looked at all these labels, and we found precautionary alcohol statements, such as may contain alcohol or some other type of alcohol declaration, was found in just over half of the brands, in 54% of all of the brands we looked at, but unfortunately only in a quarter of the BC brands that we looked at. 3 of the processors had labeling to address pregnancy or breastfeeding. One was in BC, one in the US, and one was in Alberta, but it was very rare that any precautionary statements were specifically targeted to women who may be pregnant or who are breastfeeding. There were no statements that addressed issues of risk to children. And when we looked at the handling information, that was pretty good. We found keep refrigerated statements in over 90% of the brands, and do not shake or contents under pressure in just over half of the brands. The nutrition facts and ingredient lists were found in all of the products, although there were just a few minor issues in the best before date. And there were most products did have market advertising labels, significantly things like raw and living, full of probiotics, things like that. But overall, the precautionary label statements could be better. In terms of the market advertising, other things that were often on labels were organic. Organic kombucha was mentioned in 69% of the brands that we looked at. Made in Canada, non-GMO, gluten-free, and dairy-free. So if labeling is required federally, it's generally found, but if it's precautionary, that's a voluntary statement, you don't always see it. And it's important to say, although we did find some of these, precautionary statements about alcohol, you could hardly read them. So in this particular picture, where if you look at the red arrow in very, very small print, it says it contains less than 0.5% alcohol, but it's pretty hard to read this. Best before dates, these are just some of the issues I mentioned. The type is kind of squished here and you can't see it very well. And these are some examples of the marketing statements that I mentioned earlier. So in the one on the left, millions of live cultures, it's an effervescent fermented beverage, it's refreshing, it's delivered to enlighten your taste buds. And then I love the one on the right-hand side. It talks about the Garibaldi ranges, and it's known as the tea of immortality. Kombucha is a fermented tea full of probiotics, organic acids, and healthy compounds. And this particular brand, to be fair, and I'm showing the brand name here, it does have a very clear alcohol statement right on the front. So it's good when you do see that, because consumers need to make informed choices and they need to know which products have alcohol in them. So what do we do now? This photo was sent to me. We were thinking during our project, maybe the word's getting out, because this is kind of odd to see this non-alcoholic, fresh kombucha. So what does non-alcoholic kombucha mean? And how do we know if it's non-alcoholic and meeting the regulations? So this is the portion of the presentation where I just like to take a pause and let you guys know that although, 31.5% of the kombucha we found in our study was over 1%. Yes, that's a concern, but the sky isn't falling. So these are pictures of clouds, and to say that, we had, before we even started the study, it was really good to be working with public health and different regulatory partners. We thought if we found any of the following 3 issues or triggers, we would do more rapid communication around this issue. But when we did test the first 150 samples, we never found over half of the samples above 1%. And as you know from the results that I've been saying all along, in fact, we only found around a third above 1%. So we didn't meet this threshold trigger. We definitely didn't find greater than 10% of samples testing above 2.5%. In fact, it was much less than that. And we never found any sample that tested over 5% alcohol. So although ethanol is in kombucha, it is at very low levels. One of the issues from a regulatory perspective to consider here is the alcohol in the product intentional or is it unintentional? And this has come up a lot in our discussions. So kombucha processors were not sure that they may even be aware that alcohol is a problem in their products, although they should understand that through the fermentation process. And we don't know if they are monitoring for alcohol. So how kombucha is regulated really depends on whether alcohol in a food product or beverage product is intentional or unintentional. So I'm going to spend a few minutes going through this slide around regulatory oversight. And this is how things are handled, at least in our province. So in BC and likely in other provinces, there are at least 3 regulators depending on whether the kombucha is alcoholic or non-alcoholic. And in BC, all foods, including alcoholic and non-alcoholic beverages, are regulated for safety under the Public Health Acts and Food Premises Regulation. But who looks after the licensing depends whether the product, I say that again, who looks after the licensing depends on where the product is made and whether it is imported or exported from the province. So the top line is going to show who regulates the product if the product intentionally contains alcohol. And the middle line and lower line shows non-intentional or non-alcoholic kombucha that is made in the province, or whether it's imported or exported out of the province. So this should be fairly similar for most provinces across Canada. In BC, the Liquor and Cannabis Regulatory Branch does regulate alcohol products. They license businesses making alcohol and they regulate sales to liquor stores. But they don't have oversight of premises or businesses that are making unintentional alcoholic products. And that's really important. Their inspectors have no authority to visit kombucha processors, essentially because they don't license them. If we're looking at the bottom line, the Canadian Food Inspection Agency will have oversight over imported or exported across different provinces. And these products that are manufactured under the Safe Food for Canadian regulations, they would require a license. So they would be needed in the province where the kombucha is manufactured or exported in order to make those products. They would also license kombucha importers. So the license would be needed to import a product. And if the ethanol levels exceeded federal regulation, it might be that the non-alcoholic kombucha only complies at less than or equal to 1.1% ABV. So in BC here, it's 1%. Federally, it's 1.1% ABV, and it may be a bit different in your province. So if we look at the middle line here, non-alcoholic kombucha made in the province is regulated by the Regional Health Authority. And the way our regulation works is that only immediate service of products in food service premises actually require a health or food operating permit, and the processors themselves don't get a health permit, but they do require a health approval. Sorry, it took a bit of time to go through all that. We'll have a look at the next slide. Okay, it's not going forward. Let me hit enter again. Nope. I seem to be stuck, Tina. Oh, here we go. Okay. Yep, I'm all right. It just caught up to itself. Yep. Okay, good. So progressive enforcement models, you've seen these many times. There's at the bottom of the pyramid here, we have assessment of the risk or the issue or the hazard. We have education, we have enforcement, and all the regulatory agencies that we've talked about kombucha embrace this concept of a progressive enforcement model. So what does that mean for us? As I mentioned in BC, our approach is to, in the food premises regulation, our approach is to use food safety plans or hazard analysis critical control points. So within that regulation under section 23, we require health approvals to have a food safety plan, and the food safety plan has to identify the critical limits for critical control points as well, and procedures to ensure adherence to critical limits and what happens when those critical limits are not adhered to. And the Ministry of Health has supported this position with a policy paper for health authorities that outline how these current regulations will work. So now our conversations in BC is we're trying to understand what inspectors can and should do regarding alcohol levels. So I have a few slides on this. So in terms of the assessment, when the health authority sees a health hazard not being properly controlled, one of the things that an inspector might do is let the Liquor Control Regulatory Board know about the ongoing issues. But who monitors for ethanol in food products in the marketplace is really not clear here. So similar to most foods, we don't have a surveillance program to assess risk in foods. This responsibility is really often left to the manufacturer or the processor. There are a few exceptions for us here in BC. Our dairy inspectors do take audit samples for cheese, and there are inspectors and regulators like the CFI who also conduct food tests on certain commodities during projects and during inspections. But we don't have a broad-based surveillance program for food. And what we've learned about who can be assessing the alcohol content in kombucha is that this might not be done ever except under very special circumstances. So while the health authorities can assess the food safety plan and check to see if the processor tests for alcohol, they really don't have any role to take samples and do further alcohol monitoring. And this is quite normal because we wouldn't expect them to be doing this for any other hazard either, like say salmonella in a pastry. So it's very consistent with normal practice, unless there was a special project and you were taking on that role for that. So because we mentioned earlier, the LCRB doesn't have any authority at the site of the processor, they wouldn't be taking samples either. We did ask the CFIA, and they said that they would consider kombucha as low risk. And again, you can see from the E. coli tests and the very low acidity level of that product, it is very low risk. They would inspect the processor or the product on a complaint basis, but they don't actually have a test method for ethanol, so they wouldn't be collecting samples at this time either. They would not consider a recall on products unless there were repeated violations and issues. And again, in order for that to occur, they would need to be told about them. So this part is not quite clear how alcohol will actually be tested and assessed. So really, education is where we're getting the most bang for our buck here. So we are still working on educational avenues, but this is the best thing that we can do, is to have an educational role with our processors. We believe that not all kombucha processors, perhaps even the smaller ones, may not even know alcohol is of concern. And so as inspectors and in public health, we encourage them to consult with their own association, their Kombucha Brewers Association, and seek help with their recipe and formulation. And the first step in raising awareness of these risks is to let them know that we have a concern. So we sent out reports to them with their individual results in April. And since then, several of them have contacted us and engaged with Dr. Brown at BCIT to investigate their processing methods. Throughout the project, we've done our best to engage with the regulators and share our concerns, including with the FPT Food Safety Committee, and Tina mentioned the work that we're doing through the Fermented Foods Working Group. And since that time, in June, Health Canada actually posted a statement about alcohol in relation to these kinds of fermented products, and you can see that link at the bottom of the screen. So in terms of Health Canada's position, their position on alcohol is aligned with the Public Health Agency of Canada, and they've stated that they see no risk in products with ABV level of 0.5% or less, which would be typical of most meals consumed. But what happens between 0.5% and the federally regulated level of 1.1% is not clear. So right now, their primary focus as well is on developing messages, and we support that. And the last here, as you know, is enforcement, and the enforcement options would be based on any evidence or violations found during inspections. But as you all know, since COVID started, all routine inspections have been paused. So really, any violations would have to be based from a paper-based trail during inspections at the processor site. So this is the slide that I showed earlier in terms of kombucha alcohol risk in BC, and it could be similar in other provinces. Do we have labeling to inform consumers that alcohol might be in the products that they're consuming? No, not a very good track record. 75% of the products don't have any precautionary statements about alcohol. Do we restrict the availability of kombucha? No, it's sold everywhere. In fact, we noted some of the brands that had higher levels of alcohol were sold in our parks and recreation sites. Do we have informed consumers? I think we're getting there, but right now I think there's probably not enough messaging out there to alert the public about potential alcohol risks. And the key thing here is there product stability? Uh, our study and our evidence shows that ethanol can increase in some brands of kombucha. So marketing labels will tell us kombucha is a healthy, live, probiotic beverage. But these restrictions for this type of labeling are federal, and the wording would fit the criteria. It doesn't actually fit the criteria for a natural health product. So as long as products on kombucha aren't a Schedule A health claim, for instance, things like curing cancer, obesity, as long as the claims are truthful and not misleading, they're allowable. And so we're having some struggles with how to recommend better labeling. So with the recommendations for labeling, we would like improved labeling. We'd like consumers to know that products have alcohol in them. We think that raw kombucha should be labeled keep refrigerated. But like that photo I showed you of the product Remedy, it doesn't have any sugar in it, so we may need to consider how we do this. So not all kombucha fits this description, although most of it does. And I just wanted to note, we were told that in Quebec, foods that require refrigeration, there's actually a provincial regulation that they're labeled as such. We would like to see more precautionary labels included and have processors fix up their best before dates. The other main recommendation here is that processors must be testing for ethanol in their kombucha. They need to demonstrate control during the shelf life and consumer mishandling of the product, and they should be keeping records, and they should have this specified in their critical in their HACCP plan, and have these critical limits and critical control points identified. So just another couple of quick slides. Where are we now on the project? So we've mostly got things completed. I think we have a few more health promotion activities that we'd like to do and some knowledge translation that we're working on. And we're also working on a draft peer-reviewed paper. We actually, I don't know if there's any BCIT students on the call today, but we do have their help in doing some messaging as part of their health promotion class. So I'm always grateful for that work when that gets done. Thank you very much to BCIT. And we are working with HealthLink BC on developing messages, but because of COVID, everything has been a bit behind. So in closing, I would like to acknowledge everyone on the team that has helped us with kombucha. Dr. Alyosha Tremshik has left us. He's gone back to Cornell University and he helped me with all the yeast experiments. Sarah Henderson helped with a lot of the analysis and graphs and statistics. Leela helped me very much with the report. Amani helped me mail out all the industry reports when we discovered COVID was going to be an issue and we couldn't do it through the health authorities. And Tom and David have been very good at helping with edits and putting it into perspective. And I did want to also acknowledge all the medical health officers and other people who received the report and Ministry of Health who provided a lot of excellent feedback that we incorporated into the final version. And Jin in the labs helped us with our media. So I was really happy to take this great big cart of kombucha bottles and cans back to the recycle depot. And I'm open for questions. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lorraine, for the wonderful and super informative and interesting presentation. So we'll move on to questions now. First question, is there any, sorry, Lorraine, if you open up the chat window, you should be able to read the questions. So is there any evidence of effects on breastfeeding infants if the mother has drank kombucha?
Not kombucha per se, but if we're talking about alcohol for women either during pregnancy or during breastfeeding, yes, there's evidence that when you ingest alcohol, you can transfer it to breast milk. So again, these low levels, may be an issue. During breastfeeding, I don't know that there's been any studies looking at low levels of alcohol and transfer to the infant, but well, there's the pump and dump, right? So any kind of alcohol that you're ingesting, you really shouldn't be exposing that to your infants.
Thanks. Is there a way to test ethanol levels in home brewed kombucha?
Um, you can use, it can be difficult. You can use the standard test that they have, but it may not work because of the turbidity and the cloudiness. So if you go to the Kombucha Brewers Association, they actually talk about, some of the standard tests that they use for grain, alcohol, liquors might not be too accurate, especially because they usually, they might give you um, to the percent level or to the 0.5% level. So I know that we don't have GC equipment in our back door, but yeah, it's not going to be that easy at home to test.
Okay, thanks. Were details collected to determine whether alcohol testing is conducted by the processors or food establishments making in-house kombucha for the samples tested for the study? Just wondering if this is commonplace in BC.
We are just, we did not do that. So this survey was just to go out and see what was out there. We did actually ask the health inspectors that participated to go and collect at the point of the processor. I think the next step will be when inspections resume, and during the normal course of operations, we'll be requesting them to have a look and make sure that alcohol is incorporated as a hazard into their food safety plan. But no, we did not specifically do that. Is it common? Well, it is common in BC for all processors to have a food safety plan. I know we have been asked to evaluate some in the past. I'm hoping that it becomes more common in the future, but no, I think that would be another great study to do, especially if the health authorities during routine inspections can collect that information. But there's priorities. Again, alcohol is a risk in kombucha, but I think if we address things through education, that will help get us a lot further along, and just let the processors know that we are aware that this can be an issue.
Okay, thanks. Next question. It's good to know that E. coli is not present, but could other bacteria be present? Should it be pasteurized?
No, I don't think so. It's really acidic. This is a typical fermentation. I mean, if you wanted long-term storage of any product, you could think of this a little bit like not all foods have this type of fermentation pathway where you go through alcohol to acetic acid. But sauerkraut, for instance, you can have sauerkraut that's pasteurized in a jar that sits on a shelf for a year and it's fine. Or you can have fresh sauerkraut that has all of the natural bacteria and different metabolites in it, but you keep it in the refrigerator for a few weeks or maybe a few months. So kombucha, I don't think it needs to be pasteurized, and we're not recommending that.
Okay, thank you. Next question. Oh, actually, it's more of a comment. Ethanol in breast milk decreases as mom's level of ethanol decreases via metabolism. So if the mom does not have ethanol in her system, it is not present in breast milk.
Good, okay.
Okay, thanks for that. Next question. Oh, I think this question is about the slide with information on children and ethanol.
Mm-hmm.
They're wondering if they could see the slide again.
Oh, yeah, sure. Is it this one? About other bacteria, I guess one thing of interest, unlike say cold brew or nitro cold brew coffee. So I mentioned earlier that tea and coffee starts out at a pH of 5.5, around there. So, I mean, the really good thing with kombucha is that once the fermentation occurs and it drops below a pH of 4.6, you don't have to worry about a botulism risk. So with cold brew coffee, though, you are at a pH of 5.5, and because it's packed in a way that excludes oxygen, there is that risk. We don't have that with kombucha. So yeah, you have to look at the process of a beverage or a food to really look and see where the risks are. We're displaying this slide again. I think everything will be safe. Tina, is there
Yeah.
any specific question around this slide that people would like to see again, or?
I don't think so. I think she just wanted to see the slide. The webinar is recorded and will be posted on the NCCEH website by next week, and will be sent out to everyone.